Hey everyone, I'm Victoria and welcome back to Housing Over Headlines. So, I'm going to be real for a second. Most people don't show up to do a public comment either in person or online. But that's exactly why it matters because while a lot of conversation is happening online regarding policy and what we should do, the actual decisions are being made in rooms that are pretty quiet, empty, except for usually the electeds and very few residents. Public comment isn't flashy. It's not a protest. It's not viral, but it is one of the few moments where residents can directly interrupt the script and force elected officials to respond. And you don't need to be an expert to do it. Honestly, sometimes the most important thing you can bring is a good question and a willingness to ask it out loud. So right now, the City of Escondido is taking public comment on its 2026-2027 draft of their annual action plan. And this is where things get real. This plan decides how federal money, CDBG and home funds, which we spoke about home funds in a different video, the annual action plan talks about how those funds are actually spent. So we're talking about resources that are supposed to support low and moderate income communities. And how those decisions get made is exactly what you have a chance to weigh in on with this public comment period. The comment period is open from April 16th to May 15th of 2026. After that, the window is going to close, and so will your easiest opportunity to shape what happens next. In this video, we're going to break down what's in the plan, what's worth paying attention to, and how you can form your own public comment. I'll pause, give background, and call out what matters so you're not just watching, you're actively engaging and understanding the information. There's also a link in the comments to the full staff presentation if you would like to take a deeper dive. All right, let's get into it.
All right, that takes us to public hearings, and the first one tonight is the 2025 through 2029 Housing and Urban Development Consolidated Plan and Allocation Process for fiscal year 26 through 27, and I'll turn the time over to our presenters.
Tonight we're holding the first of two public hearings for our 2026-2027 Annual Action Plan. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to conduct the first of two required public hearings. The second public hearing will come before you on May 20th. At that meeting, we will bring the funding recommendations for Council's consideration. Tonight, we'll be asking Council to reaffirm or amend the priorities of the 2025-2029 5-year consolidated plan. The current priorities were approved on June 25th. Every year at the first public hearing for this process, Council has the opportunity to review, reaffirm, or amend these priorities. We'll also be asking Council to approve an allocation process for fiscal year 2026-27 for the CDBG funds to utilize the maximum 15% allowable for public services and 20% allowable for administration. And lastly, we'll be asking Council to approve the release of an RFP for CDBG funding. We'll be looking for some guidance on a few questions regarding the RFP. And again, as I said, we'll have a slide at the end to guide that discussion.
All right, just to point out here, there's two public hearings. This one that was on April 8th is the first. There's the public comment period runs till May 15th, and then on May 20th, we're gonna have the second public hearing, which will look like this, but the City Council will be voting. And the issues that they're considering, they're gonna be voting to approve, the allocations and the RFPs. But an RFP is a request for a proposal, and they generally will ask for organizations. In this case, I think it's organizations that will be providing services to the community using the CDBG funds. So the purpose of the public hearings are to foster discussion between local government and residents. You want to keep in mind while we're watching to see if that's happening, if you feel like there is a discussion on these issues or if the decisions seem predetermined. And so during the public comment period, these are the three issues that they're addressing. The public comment is on the action plan, but the things that are in the action plan that they're specifically discussing are the priorities of spending, that are in the consolidation plan. There's approval of the allocation process. They're discussing that. And then authorizing the release of an RFP. So the action plan, the changes in the action plan are centered around this.
So tonight's focus is on community development block grant serves low and moderate income residents and or areas and improves living environments, resources, and economic opportunities. As a recipient of the federal funds, the city is required to submit 2 plans, one of them being the 5-year consolidated plan, which outlines the city's goals and priorities. Like I said, the current consolidated plan was approved by Council on June 25th, 2025, and that covers July 1, 2025 through June 30th, 2029. Today, we'll be asking the Council to reaffirm or amend those priorities. In addition to our 5-year plan, we're required to submit an annual action plan. The action plan outlines specifically how we'll spend the money each year. After tonight's meeting and based on the guidance received, we'll begin the process of writing the 2026-2027 annual action plan, which we'll be bringing back to you on May 20th. So here we have the 25-29 consolidated plan priorities that we're asking you to consider this evening. There are 4 of them. They are to support the development and preservation of affordable rental and homeowner units, expand access to supportive services to prevent and reduce homelessness, promote safe and healthy communities by improving public facilities, upgrading infrastructure, and supporting neighborhood revitalization efforts, and delivering essential supportive services to vulnerable populations. Again, these priorities are reviewed on an annual basis and can be amended as needed. During the council discussion, we will be asking you 2 questions regarding these priorities. 1, would you like to reaffirm or amend them? And 2, should the RFP for CDBG funding focus on any of these in particular, or should it be, or should the RFP cover all of the priorities like it usually does?
Okay, so this slide shows the consolidated plan priorities. So that's the plan that covers 2025 to 2029. Council approved this back in June of 2025. And while they are voting on this today, and that ostensibly they've already made that decision, this can still be a point of public comment. What the priorities are, and if you think that there's any that are missing, if you think there needs to be a realignment. So up for discussion, they're going to be asking whether these priorities should be amended or changed, and they're considering, in making policy, whether there should be a focus on any one of these specific priorities. Because, as was just explained, currently the city treats each of these priorities equally, which means that when they're looking to spend the funds from CDBG, preventing and reducing homelessness has the same priority as improving infrastructure. And it's not really being assessed as to what is the need right now, or if the needs have changed since last year. So we're going to be keeping an ear out for that discussion as well.
We have an example of how our allocation is typically broken down. We don't have, this number is for the 2025-2026 funding year. We don't have our 26-27 yet. We typically receive that around May or June. So hopefully for the next public hearing, we'll have the exact dollar amount for you. But this allocation is based on a HUD mandated formula that factors in population, poverty level, and other demographic and economic development data. Per HUD regulation, we can use up to 20% of our allocation for administration. We can use up to 15% for public services, and then the remainder would go to capital projects. Just the admin portion of this pays for the neighborhood services staff and the operating budget specific to CDBG. The public service funds go to programs such as Alabaster Jar, Mama's Kitchen, Palomar Family Health, and then the neighborhood revitalization and capital expenses are for the projects that you see that make a physical difference in our community. So these are public facilities and infrastructure improvements.
I just want to break a couple things down on this slide. The funding that you have here is predetermined mostly by HUD, because this is a HUD program. There is only 15% allowed for public services. That's set. The admin has a maximum of 20% that could be spent. This is not set in stone. Some cities don't spend any, some spend part. And I guess Escondido's decided they're going to spend all of it. It would be nice to see a breakdown of what they're spending the admin on. It was mentioned that it's paying for staff services, for running the CDBG program and some other items. But looking at this budget, I think would be important, because any funds that they can use that would be not needed to be allocated here could then be used to expand capital and neighborhood revitalization programs. So they can go anywhere, from 65 to maybe 70%. You could do that, have a little bit more funds that way. So those are some budgeting options that weren't mentioned in this slide.
Next, we'll talk about the RFP for CDBG funding. Pending council approval, staff will release an RFP for that funding next week. At the end of March, staff will review applications and prepare recommendations on funding. During the month of April, staff will conduct one-on-one meetings with council members to review proposals and then draft the annual action plan to bring back before you on May 20th. On this slide, you will see all of the items for your consideration this evening. They all impact the RFP in some way, and your decision on these questions will guide how we will finalize writing that RFP. I will put these questions back up on the screen during the council discussion, but very briefly, they are: do you want to reaffirm or amend the priorities? Should the RFP have a specific focus? Do you want to approve an allocation maximizing the admin and public service CDBG dollars? Should funding limits be placed on grant requests? And should CDBG continue to fund internal city departments?
All right, so at the end, we're going to revisit these questions and think about if they were addressed or discussed, or just yes or no without any discussion. That's important to think about, whether or not these answers were already predetermined, if they were given thought, planned out, because asking critical questions and contemplating alternatives for funding is an important part of being a leader. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to what's being said and what's not being asked here as well.
So this slide shows the public services that we funded over the last 5 years. You can see how our allocation has fluctuated slightly. The last 2 years have been pretty stable, but prior to that, we were seeing pretty regular reductions in our allocation every year. For fiscal 23-24, this is actually an example of when staff and council chose not to fund public services at the 20% cap. This happened most likely because there was a larger capital project that needed additional funding at that time. The public services that are bold are the ones that are run by city departments. We currently only fund 2 city services, and they are the Senior Resource Program out of the Park Avenue Community Center and the Mobile Recreation Program, which is a free camp out at Grove Park over the summer. One of the questions up for discussion this evening is whether or not to continue funding city-run public services. If we choose not to do that, the impact of that would be an increase of $19,000 to the older adult services budget and $8,600 to the recreation budget.
So here, this is the public services portion of that pie chart we saw earlier, the 15%. These are the programs that were funded in previous years, including, this is the current year, 25-26. We're talking about funding that they don't have figures for 26-27. They didn't have them at the time of this meeting. At the end of, after their the staff presentation, we're going to look at what's in the amended plan, which has the numbers for next year. They're pretty much in line with what you see here. It's a slight increase over 2025, 2026, but it is interesting in here to see the difference in the fundings. She explained that in 23-24 and 24-25, there was less than 15% given. For public services, it's worthwhile noting that 2023 was when this new administration took office. So they own these numbers. And we will be going back to look and see what decisions were made back then, because those decisions affect everything going on in the future. Beyond that, you can also have a look at the senior program and how that's changed. And what changed here was in that 23-24 budget decision, it was decided, apparently, it looks like, to take out the funding for transportation and nutritional services. Really interesting to me to see that pattern. So then in the third row, it shows over time what's changed with the program. This looks like the portion of the public services program to provide meals. And then you have in the last row how the funding has changed. Funding choices have changed as to which third-party organizations get funding and not.
On this table, we have the capital and neighborhood revitalization projects for the last 5 years. So this is quite opposite from our public services in that the majority of the funding goes towards city infrastructure projects. What I mean by city projects is that they are managed by city staff, typically public works or engineering. Construction projects are still competitively bid with a contractor doing the actual construction. They're just managed through, like I said, city departments. And then the projects on the bottom row there are the external subrecipients that have been funded over the last 5 years.
All right, so this table here has capital and neighborhood revitalization programs or spending for that portion of the budget. That was the larger piece of the pie that was 65%, if you remember that graphic a couple slides ago. It's basically the same as the slide we just watched on the public services spending. It's showing over time what programs are being run here. You can see the change over time for what the priorities have been. You can also see, it's kind of interesting to see what's changed from here to here, because this again is the jump from 22-23 to 23-24 is when we had the last administration change. So it's interesting to see here how that's the change in priorities are reflected in that year. So that's a little bit of what's going on here. We are going to be looking at 26-27 spending and making comments about that at the end. We'll be looking at the annual plan and seeing what the spending looks like in there for the next year.
All right, we'll close the public hearing, and I'll open it up to the City Council for questions and comments.
Thank you for the presentation. As always, you guys do an awesome job. What can you break down the capital? I'm not sure if you had a slide on that, but I just want to see a little bit more details on that, the breakdown. Okay, can you kind of just provide some background or some educate us on how do we get these categories as opposed to the other ones from prior ones that we've seen? I guess just kind of background on how we decided on that, I think would be really.
I appreciate the question here to put in context how these programs are chosen, how these organizations that provide the programs are chosen for the capital improvements. That question, one of the underlying ways that they're chosen, or should be, based on what we've learned, is by aligning with the priorities. And so let's see if those are discussed in answering this question.
Well, typically, city staff identify projects that need to be done, or through our neighborhood groups, we identify projects that need to be done, such as like the sidewalk infill project. And then they are vetted through a group of staff. We have a capital subcommittee, well, I don't know if it's subcommittee, but a capital groups committee that we take projects to. And then projects that seem like they are viable will come through the application process. So the CDBG application or the RFP that we're talking about putting out, that is for internal and external subrecipients. So they would come in through that process. Projects that seem like they are viable will come through the application process. So the CDBG application or the RFP that we're talking about putting out, that is for internal and external subrecipients. So they would come in through that process.
All right, so no discussion here about priorities and how they impact choosing what programs or projects get elevated and get chosen to move forward. There is a shift to talking about neighborhood groups and capital groups. So it would be interesting to know if meetings with these groups are open to the public or publicized so that the public knows about them and can attend as well. All right, so this is the City of Escondido's website, and the only mention of a capital improvement groups are these meetings that were scheduled in December with each council member. I'm not quite sure if that's what was being referenced in the discussion about how the projects for capital improvement are being chosen. But this is something to think about when we look back at the questions and the actual goal of the CDBG program, which is to affect improvements in neighborhoods with low and moderate income residents and an overall need for housing and help for people experiencing homelessness.
We have had projects in previous years that were requested very large amounts of money that were denied just because maybe they weren't, not just, but maybe they weren't project ready. So we also have to remember that we have a timeliness test that we have to meet with CDBG. So we want to make sure that projects that we select are ready to go and that money can be spent. So they've been denied for those reasons and or that they're asking maybe for too much funding. And so we wouldn't want to allocate a majority of the funding to one project, as we like to spread that around. And so that kind of leads into one of the questions about, do we want to limit how much we fund per grant application? I can give you our recommendation if you would like, or if you want to, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, that would be great, because that was actually part of my next question. And then the other part was, for the ones that didn't qualify for whatever reason, I'm assuming that they were told why they didn't qualify or what they needed to be adjusted in order to qualify.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes, we respond to everyone that applies.
Okay. Then, yeah, would you be able to provide like the cap of the one that you had just mentioned for each project?
What we're recommending for public services is that we provide, actually I do have a, I believe I have it. What we're recommending for public services is a cap from between $10,000 and $50,000. Typically, what we have awarded in the past on the low end is $8,600, and on the higher end is $35,000. We have had requests in the like $70,000 range, so that's why we bumped it up to about 50. But we feel that 50 allows for us to still be able to fund multiple programs. Also, putting these limitations on what a subrecipient can request, it just creates a clear expectation, because we have had some people that have, like I said, they've put in an application, it's been too high, especially for public services.
Has there been a time when it was high, but we chose to fill some of it?
Yes.
Along with other programs?
Yes.
So even if it was capped, we could still divvy it up any way we wanted?
Technically, yes.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
so a couple things for council to consider. I think historically on the capital side, the issue has been timeliness of expenditure, and that's why it's gravitated to city programs. On the other side of the fence, one of the challenges is the available funding versus the needs of the program. And traditionally, the program has tried to fund as many programs as it possibly can. That has been one of the drivers in this. But last year, there was one proposal that was proposing to take the entire public services budget, and unfortunately, that they didn't understand any limitations. So by establishing a limitation, you're also helping guide the applicant and having them put forward a realistic proposal if the council still wants to fund an array of programs. So you're communicating to them the limits, and then that helps them craft a proposal. If you don't put any limits out there, they struggle with what am I writing, what's my potential award amount. You're providing a structure for a dialogue by establishing these limits with the.
So real quick here, just to note that funding as many programs as possible, the motive behind that is you want to help out as many people as possible. That doesn't necessarily translate to having a wider amount of organizations using a finite amount of resources. This is a relatively small amount of money that we're talking about. And so, funding as many programs as possible can dilute the power of the funding. Sorry, I'm just taking off my glasses. Providing a structure for prioritized funding with very limited resources. So necessarily just giving a small amount to a larger number of programs isn't going to help, say, preventing homelessness as much as you would think if the programs aren't getting enough funding, if they're having to stack funding or whatever. So this is a point where a discussion about the city's priorities on spending would be useful, because if you can target that spending based on the needs of Escondido in the year 2026 to 2027 and what the projected needs are based on where we're at today, you can get a more targeted priority and more targeted funding with maybe less organizations. But that would be an interesting discussion to have.
Question again, the graffiti removal, that program was moved to the general fund, right?
That's
So
correct.
we're just not, it's not that we're not doing it anymore, it's just in the general fund?
That's right.
What were the two items that you said we could move somewhere else? $19,000 and $8,600?
Yes, that was for the public services. So that is the question on whether to continue to fund internal service departments. So it's, if you look at year 25-26, it's the mobile recreation, which is a free summer camp out at Grove Park. That funding is $8,600. That would hit the recreation's general fund budget if it was removed from here. And then the senior resource program out at the Park Avenue Community Center, and that was $19,500.
Just to make sure I'm hearing this correctly, we're not talking about eliminating those, just moving them to the general fund.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
I would support that.
So I would just say, council, just be aware that that means that you're increasing your general fund obligation, which is already stretched. So part of the reason they're in here, part of this is to provide transparency. I'm not saying you can direct us to do that.
Understood.
The challenge is that there are impacts then to the general fund budget that correspond to that, right? Now, there potentially could be other outlets. I'm not saying don't do it. The dollar amount is about $36,000. I'm just saying, just understand the implication of doing that.
Understood. All right, thank you.
Would you like me to go back to the questions?
Are you done?
Well, I just want to comment real quick that I really like, as far as, because here on the agenda in page 156, just implementing the funding range will allow the city to support multiple organizations, ensuring a more equitable distribution of available funds, which I really support.
And this is talking more about how the focus being on funding as many organizations as possible versus prioritizing funding, and having, an actual set priority of where this funding should go and where those dollars would be most productively spent. It doesn't really translate to having a high number of organizations to give it to.
Question about the senior resources. So we're no longer doing senior transportation?
No, we don't fund, in 22, 23,
Okay.
they stopped funding transportation and nutrition.
Just a little thought in my head that went off with this interaction is they stopped funding that. This we saw in the chart before that those funds stopped in 2023, 2024, which was the first year of this city's new administration with the new mayor. So that is within this administration's tenure. So it's not they stopped it, it's we. Um, so the ownership on that is missing just a little bit. I'm really interested to what the discussion was like taking away those services from seniors. We'll probably go back in time in another video and look and see what that conversation was.
Right, I had a question about the 19,000 to the 8,000 too. My concern is around that our seniors are among our most vulnerable neighbors, so I'm glad to hear that this is not about cutting it, but that the possibility of, or the discussion about moving it to a different fund. So, and also with the same, with the $8,000 regarding the mobile recreation. Because these are opportunities for our families that many times can't afford any other type of recreation, especially during the summer. So once again, I'm happy to hear that this is a discussion about possibly moving them, but not canceling them. Should we put a limit to answer your question? Yes, I would agree with that. I think it would be something very positive because I do recall us having that discussion about some of the requesters putting amounts of money that just couldn't be done. And this way it will provide an opportunity to be able to for them to figure out how they can work with what is available. But I would like that if there is a need that they would like to request additional funds, that there's a process how they can do that. Okay, this is what you need to do in order to be able to request an additional amount because of. So I would like some explanation on the form so they could do that. The percentages, that was explained to us, I remember last time that these were the reasons for that. I would vote to reaffirm the plan as it stands. And looking at your questions, pretty much I think that's it. So thank you.
So, the questions have been addressed here, but is there a deeper discussion going on? This council member correctly said that seniors are a really vulnerable population. They need support. Their income flow is reduced or stopped because many of them can't work. So why not talk about restoring services that were cut back in 2023? I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that this council member was on the city council at that time. It was mentioned by staff that the ride service and nutritional services were cut. Why? Why is this simply left as a referral program when there are other ways to give referral services to people that may not cost as much or could be tied into a program that also provides ride services or nutritional service, one or the other or both, or at least having a discussion on the possibility of restoring these important services to this vulnerable population.
Did we answer all your questions?
I believe so. If I could maybe just go through these really quickly just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So we're going to reaffirm the priorities as they are. How about the RFP? Should there be a focus on a specific priority or keep it open to all of the priorities.
If we keep it open to all the priorities, we can still
You can-
allocate towards one specific one.
That's correct.
Okay, then I would be for keeping it open.
Okay?
Okay.
So again, keeping the priorities open and making all four equally important is a way to go. And it does make it easier to spend money in different areas without a lot of discussion. But that's kind of the point. Discussions are needed by leadership to evaluate and assess the needs of this moment for the city of Escondido when we have rising homelessness, um, affordability problems, the need for certain community services and capital infrastructure. There's also programs that weren't mentioned that exist that could be used, could use these funds to revitalize some of the neighborhoods. Um, not having a substantive discussion on amending the priorities or even what the priorities are and what's needed to given the current state of homelessness, not having that discussion, just answering it with a quick yes, no, let's make this decision. It doesn't appear that a lot of thought was given to where these funds should go, where they would be most effective. And here's why that's important, because when there's no priority set, the city has no obligation to prioritize spending, like we said, for homelessness, for seniors, for vulnerable populations, for any type of a fund, specific targeted funding. And it's kind of like that saying, when you stand for nothing, you fall for everything. Having those prioritized discussions and clearly setting out the city's priorities makes spending more efficient and profitable, quite frankly, because it's not just about bringing in funds, but spending those funds where they will do the most good.
And then the allocation process, we will stick with the 20% admin, 15 public service, 65 capital. Should funding limits be placed on the grant? We're saying yes, right? I just want to be clear that it's only for public services and it will be $10,000 to $50,000. We are leaving the capital side open.
So this is a point that's been discussed, and it's basically saying that for providers putting in a request for putting in a proposal to request funds for providing public services, that they'll be capped at $50,000. There's been a discussion about that. Apparently, that's decided. However, again, to the point of making these funds the most effective, maybe not funding as many people as many organizations as possible would be in the best interest if you had a prioritization of what you wanted those funds to accomplish and work backwards from there to see which organizations could provide targeted services for the accomplishment of that specific priority, like impacting housing, affecting homelessness, preventing homelessness, whatever the priority that would be set would be, then you could have a targeted review of those proposals and only fund services for the organizations for those targeted proposals. It would make the targeting of the choosing for the proposal, the organizations that are going to provide the service. It would help when you're picking which service provider would be most impactful with those funds. So not necessarily making the importance be on a limit for funding, but more of what the priority is and which service providers would fall more in line with that. So that you might give more funding than 50,000, but then that program would be more impactful at preventing homelessness or making housing more affordable, whatever. But this is for the public services side, not for the capital improvement side. They're not going to have that cap.
And that is to maintain our flexibility with spending those funds in a timely manner. And then should CDBG continue to fund departments, city departments? That's still kind of up in the air.
It is for me. Go ahead.
I have a question about that. I mean, those are important programs to have. is it, if, and I don't know if the city manager has insight to this, but is it better for us to use CDBG funds because it's maybe harder to find funding outside of the general fund for that? Or are there other grants that we could use for that?
We could explore options in the budget process. I would recommend continuing to have them apply, and then that can be part of the decision-making process as we go through it, right? I mean, but I wanted it transparent that there has been a tradition of funding city operations. I think where the challenge might be is on the capital side and quickly expensing those dollars. But as people learn about the program and becomes more clarity, there might be more applicants in that space. So I would recommend to council that you visit that when you start to go to the award part of the process, and that will be closer to the budget process. And so then we can talk about where those, where potentially to move those internal requests at that time.
So it seems like waiting gives us more options, allowing them to continue under this process, but then later on we can decide to fund them differently.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Great. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to have a look here at the annual action plan. That was the draft that's now posted on the city website for Escondido. This lays out the spending for each project based on which program it is and what it does. So we're going to look at number 2. This is CDBG and administration. It speaks here about the amount. So this is the dollar amount based on, I believe, updated funding amounts, because the numbers are a little bit different from the presentation that we saw. I mean, they would be different from last year. So this is the amount, 278,000, almost 279 there for the admin. There are no breakdowns here about what that admin is going to go for. Okay, so the third project listed here is public services under the CDBG program. They're targeted for 2026, 2027 for about $209,000. So then if we scroll down a little bit, these are the planned activities that they've decided on. So you have CSA San Diego, tenant and landlord services. Senior Cares is the senior referral program that they spoke about that now does not include nutrition services or transportation. Voices for Children, they have that as $10,000. This provides advocacy for foster youth. Meals on Wheels is proposed to get $25,000. You have San Marcos Promise Project, $30,000. The Alabaster Jar Project, $40,000, and Escondido Education Compact, another $40,000. This is the group that we looked at in our second video on the expiring home funds, and they did some really wonderful work with another CDBG program to spend down COVID funds. So that is the breakdown right now for the public service, that 15% of the funding there. And then we have the neighborhood revitalization. So this is the 65%. There we have the $856,000 being allocated there. And then this is the breakdown of what we're being explained. It doesn't have allocations. They may still be in the process of doing that. But this is what's listed as being part of that $856,000 expenditure there. You have the Vine Institute. This is an AgX regional innovation hub. So this is a farm program. You can actually look this up and Google it. It's a very worthwhile program, but it's interesting the funding amount that they're putting in here. I know that they are, when they gave their presentation in City Council, they were talking about, you know, helping local farmers. So that might be how this ties to CDBG funds. Urban Core recycling fencing replacement project. They provide jobs for youth, local use. Washington Park playground sidewalk, um, at Jesmond Denny Park playground fence, Metropolitan Area Advisory Committee on Anti-Poverty. Uh, Interested to see what projects these are, the Sensia or Ivy. There is a development called Ivy in Escondido. It's not affordable housing, so I'm not be interested to see what this project is. And Shawback Humanitarian Bank. Uh, Sounds interesting, but it would be nice to hear from staff and be able to give some input on these programs before the decisions are made to give the allocations there. There really was not a clear substantive public discussion about what the city is prioritizing among these four priorities, which is of higher relevance. Not really a discussion surrounding that, or how these funds should be used to address the issues that we often hear about, issues like homelessness, housing instability, and cuts to senior services. When we don't have those discussions, funding can end up spread thin across multiple programs without a clear strategy for making a measurable impact where it's needed most. And we've seen this pattern before. Programs that are expected to solve big problems but aren't funded at the level that actually allows them to succeed. So if you're thinking about submitting a public comment, this is one issue where your voice can really matter. What should the city prioritize? Should those funds be concentrated to create meaningful impact or distributed more broadly? How should the city be held accountable for those outcomes? These are the kind of questions that can shift the conversation. If you found this helpful, there's a few links in the comments. One is an info sheet to guide you and help you draft your own public comment. And there's again, I'll remind you that there's also a link to the full city council presentation, the whole meeting, if you want to click on that and take a look. It was great talking with you today. Thanks for coming. See you next time.